USS Langley was the United States Navy's first operational aircraft carrier, and as such, she was the scene of numerous milestone events. Nicknamed the Covered Wagon, Langley was named after Samuel Langley, who was an early American aviation pioneer, astronomer, and physicist. Langley began her life in October of 1911, when her keel was laid down at the Mare Island Navy Yard in Vallejo, California, as the collier USS Jupiter. She was launched on August 24, 1912. At 542 feet long and 65 feet wide, Jupiter displaced more than 19,000 tons and was armed with four 4-inch 50-caliber deck guns. She was the first turbo-electric-powered ship in the U.S. Navy and was rated for 7,200 shaft horsepower. Her top speed was a pedestrian 15 knots, and when cruising at 10 knots, Jupiter had a range of 3,500 nautical miles. Jupiter was commissioned into the United States Navy on April 7, 1913. After completing her sea trials, she joined the Pacific Fleet in April of 1914, while it was off the western coast of Mexico. In early October, she departed for Philadelphia, and on October 12th, she became the first vessel to transit from the Pacific to the Atlantic through the newly finished Panama Canal. In the years leading up to American entry into World War I, she cruised the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico with the Atlantic Fleet Auxiliary Division. In April of 1917, she was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transport Service and subsequently completed 2 voyages to France in support of operations on the Western Front. The first voyage was made in June of 1917 and transported a naval aviation detachment to England. It was the first U.S. aviation detachment to arrive in Europe and was commanded by Lieutenant Kenneth Whiting, who would become Langley's first commanding officer 5 years later. In early 1919, she crossed the Atlantic for a third time for coaling duty in European waters. Jupiter's conversion to the U.S. Navy's first aircraft carrier was authorized on July 11, 1919. She steamed to the Norfolk Navy Yard in December, and on March 24, 1920, she was decommissioned. In April, Jupiter was renamed Langley and given the hull number CV-1. Langley was to serve the U.S. Navy as a test platform for the aircraft carrier ship type. Her flight deck was 534 feet in length, and it was constructed over the ship's original bridge. She was equipped with an amidships elevator and initially had catapults installed both fore and aft. One unusual feature of Langley was the carrier pigeon house erected on her stern between a pair of 5-inch guns that were mounted there. However, the use of carrier pigeons was soon discontinued, and the space became Langley's executive officers' quarters. Langley was recommissioned on March 20, 1922, with Commander Kenneth Whiting in command. This was fitting, as it was Commander Whiting who had first proposed the idea of converting a collier to an aircraft carrier 3 years earlier. After completing her sea trials and fitting out period, she departed Norfolk on September 18th for her shakedown cruise. A number of aviation experiments were conducted during her shakedown, the first of which occurred on October 17, 1922, when Lieutenant Virgil C. Griffin piloted the first plane off her deck. Though this was not the first instance of an airplane being flown off a ship, as that had occurred over a decade before, and by this time several U.S. battleships had flying off platforms. This one was much more monumentally important for U.S. naval aviation, as it ushered in a new era, an era that would see the flyboys rise to the forefront of the service. On October 26th, Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Chevalier made the first landing aboard Langley. Over the following 10 days, landing tests continued through varying wind conditions, thankfully without casualties. On November 18th, Commander Whiting became the first aviator to be catapulted from a carrier's deck. In January 1923, Langley shifted her operations and tests to the Gulf of Mexico. Operating out of Pensacola, Florida, Langley's crew began conducting experiments that would help to define the standard operating procedures of U.S. naval aviation for years to come. Of note were the experiments conducted on February 21st. Through these exercises, it was determined that it took 2 minutes to prepare the deck following each landing. While returning to Pensacola on March 5th, Langley ran aground on the north side of the channel. With the assistance of the fleet tug Allegheny, she was pulled free just before midnight. Fortunately, she did not suffer any damage. After steaming south later that month and briefly entering the Pacific, she returned to Norfolk in May. On June 1st, Langley steamed up the Chesapeake Bay and into the Potomac River, bound for Washington, D.C. After arriving at the Washington Navy Yard on the 2nd, she conducted flying demonstrations for civilian and military dignitaries and hosted President Warren G. Harding for the first presidential visit aboard a U.S. aircraft carrier. Langley arrived back at Norfolk on June 12th, and afterwards she conducted training along the Atlantic coast through the end of the year. During this period, she made port calls at prominent East Coast cities in an effort to promote naval aviation. Upon entering a port, a takeoff and landing schedule was posted so that interested civilians could watch the aviators operate. In January 1924, Langley participated in her first fleet problem, which was the third installment of the annual training exercise. In May, she conducted another critical experiment when Lieutenant Wallace M. Dillon was launched by catapult carrying a dummy torpedo while she lay at anchor in Pensacola Bay. After spending the summer and early autumn at Norfolk for repairs and alterations, she departed for the West Coast to join the Pacific Battle Fleet. Langley cleared San Diego on March 2, 1925, for Fleet Problem 5. In a foreshadowing of future things to come, the fleet deployed in a circular cruising formation around Langley for the first time. This formation was developed by the Battle Fleet's Assistant Chief of Staff, Commander Chester W. Nimitz. At one point during the exercise, Langley launched 10 planes in 13 minutes and also had aircraft aloft simultaneously conducting missions lasting more than 2 hours. After the conclusion of the exercise, Langley continued to operate off the West Coast until shifting to Hawaiian waters in mid-April for Army-Navy Exercise No. 3. In July, Langley visited Australia and New Zealand with the Battle Fleet, and upon her return, again trained around the Hawaiian territory until being dispatched to the West Coast in late September. Langley steamed south in late January of 1926 for Fleet Problem 6, which was held off the coast of Central America. Fleet Problem 6 was the shortest of the 21 interwar fleet problems, and Langley once more proved that naval aviation deserved a place at the table. Her pilots managed to get airborne despite heavy seas that prevented the fleet's battleships and cruisers from launching and recovering their floatplanes. This enabled her side to evade the aggressor force and avoid a direct engagement. She spent the remainder of the year exercising off the West Coast before entering the Mare Island Navy Yard for an overhaul in November. In late February of 1927, Langley got underway for Central American waters to participate in the Joint Army-Navy exercise that was held during the first week of March. Afterwards, she transited the Panama Canal to participate in Fleet Problem 7, which was held in the Caribbean during mid-March. She remained in the Atlantic upon the conclusion of the exercise and operated in the waters around Cuba until heading for the Brooklyn Navy Yard for an overhaul in early May. By the end of June, she was back in the Pacific, and she subsequently spent the remainder of 1927 engaged in short-term training cruises along the Southern California coast. Langley opened 1928 undergoing another overhaul at Mare Island, during which her flight deck was lengthened and her arresting gear was improved. She got underway in April to participate in Fleet Problem 8, which was held in Hawaiian waters. Her new alterations, along with her crew's improved efficiency in plane handling, enabled her to launch and keep a record 16 aircraft in the air simultaneously during the exercise, and they charted a course to Oahu in advance of her fleet's approach, which allowed them to reach Pearl Harbor undetected. On the heels of Fleet Problem 8, Major General Fox Connor proposed a minor joint Army-Navy exercise to test the Hawaiian Territory's defenses. On May 16, 1928, 2 battleship task forces and another, smaller one centered around Langley, steamed south from Lahaina Roads. After dark, the 3 task forces turned north toward Oahu. Langley launched her aircraft just before dawn, and they obtained complete surprise on the unsuspecting forces defending Wheeler Field and other installations throughout Oahu. As the battleships withdrew at 7:30 that morning, they were covered by Langley's aircraft, which were able to fight off the Army Air Corps' attempt at attacking the force. Langley subsequently remained in Hawaiian waters into June, conducting flight operations before returning to the West Coast. She spent the remainder of the year off Southern California, once again conducting short training cruises, until heading to Mare Island for an overhaul in November. Upon the completion of her overhaul, Langley got underway for a brief visit to the East Coast and arrived in Philadelphia on March 20, 1929. She subsequently conducted operations off the Virginia Capes during April, before returning to the Pacific. She then spent the summer and early fall operating out of San Diego until steaming north to the Puget Sound Navy Yard for an overhaul in November. Langley returned to the Atlantic to participate in Fleet Problem 10 in March of 1930 and Fleet Problem 11, which was held a month later. She remained in the Atlantic until June, when she got underway for San Diego with the Battle Fleet. After remaining in port for most of the summer, Langley put to sea in mid-November to accommodate the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, David S. Ingalls, in his quest to become a carrier-qualified aviator. Accompanying the Assistant Secretary at the time was the famed entertainer Will Rogers. Ingalls ended up conducting a series of launchings and landings, with Rogers even accompanying him on some of the hops. After participating in Fleet Problem 12 in March of 1931, Langley shifted to the Atlantic and was assigned to the Scouting Fleet. After undergoing an overhaul at Norfolk in May and June, she spent the next several months off the East Coast training and conducting experiments, including the initial landing tests of the new Naval autogyro plane, or helicopter as it's known today. On September 23rd, an XOP-1 completed 3 landings and takeoffs aboard Langley while she was underway, which marked another first for the veteran aircraft carrier. In October, she steamed up the York River to Yorktown, Virginia, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the British surrender. A month later, she steamed north to conduct cold weather tests off the coast of New England. For 9 days, Langley and her men tested the cold weather operating capabilities of carrier deck gear and aircraft, as well as the effectiveness of protective flight clothing. Afterward, she steamed south and conducted additional training off the Virginia coast before standing into Hampton Roads, where she lay at anchor through the end of the year. Langley transited the Panama Canal in early February of 1932 and in mid-March participated in Fleet Problem 13. Afterwards, she headed to Mare Island for an overhaul, where she subsequently spent the summer of 1932. While underway on the night of November 5, 1932, a Boeing F-3B crashed onto her deck, broke up, and skidded overboard. The pilot was rescued by the plane guard, but it was determined that Langley should no longer serve as a nighttime training platform given her slow speed. From 1933 to 1936, Langley followed a similar routine: participation in the annual fleet problems during the spring, then exercises and training off the West Coast during the summer, followed by yard time late in the year. On August 18, 1936, Langley was conducting flight operations near San Clemente, California, when the 16,511th and final trap on her flight deck occurred. The following day, she conducted her last launch in advance of standing into San Diego. Langley was detached from the battle force in mid-September and entered the Mare Island Navy Yard on October 25th to be converted into a seaplane tender. On April 21, 1937, she was recommissioned and redesignated AV-3. Over the next 2 years, Langley participated in Fleet Problems 18 and 19 in the Pacific before returning to the Atlantic for Fleet Problem 20, which would be her last. After a brief visit to New York for the opening of the 1939 World's Fair in late April, She headed back to the Pacific and was assigned to the Asiatic Fleet. Langley spent the next 2 years conducting operations throughout the Philippine archipelago, which included supporting various seaplane units and scouting locations for potential bases. When news arrived of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Langley was moored at the U.S. Naval base in Cavite. She got underway later that day with the oilers Pecos and Trinity, and after several stops, the group reached Darwin, Australia on January 1st. For the next several weeks, Langley aided the Royal Australian Air Force by running anti-submarine patrols in the Darwin area. On January 20th, a Kingfisher floatplane from Langley dropped a bomb that detonated close to the conning tower of the Japanese submarine I-124. The submarine was later sunk by the destroyer Edsall and 3 Australian corvettes. Langley departed Darwin on February 11, 1942, and steamed to Fremantle in Western Australia, where she arrived on the 19th. 3 days later, Langley departed Fremantle with 2 Australian troop transports, the U.S. cargo ship Sea Witch and the light cruiser USS Phoenix. She was carrying 32 Curtiss P-40E Warhawks of the Far East Air Force's 13th Pursuit Squadron, along with their pilots and ground crews. While en route, Langley and Sea Witch were ordered to deliver the much-needed aircraft to Cilacap, Java. On February 27th, the U.S. destroyers Whipple and Edsall joined Langley at around 7:20 a.m. They were to serve as Langley's anti-submarine screen for the final leg of her journey. At 11:40 a.m., while still about 74 miles from Cilacap, 16 twin-engine Mitsubishi G-4M1 bombers attacked Langley and her escorts. Rather than dropping all their bombs at once, though, they released partial salvos, and, since they were level bombing from medium altitude, Langley was able to alter her helm when the bombs were released and evade the first and second attempts on her. The bombers subsequently changed their tactics on the third pass and bracketed Langley on all sides. She was struck by 5 bombs and had 3 near misses as well. The P-40s on her abbreviated flight deck burst into flames, and her steering was impaired as she began listing 10 degrees to port. Her engine rooms were flooded, and Langley was soon dead in the water. Just after 1:30, the order to abandon ship was passed. Whipple picked up 308 of Langley's crew and passengers, and Edsall picked up an additional 177. After rescuing her survivors, the escorting destroyers fired 9 4-inch shells and 2 torpedoes into the covered wagon to ensure her sinking. Langley stubbornly went down about 75 miles south of Java. In order to avoid additional Japanese air attacks, the destroyers cleared the vicinity and rendezvoused with the fleet oiler Pecos near Christmas Island the next day. Some of Langley's survivors were transferred to the oiler. Unfortunately, on March 1st, those sailors endured the demise of another ship when Pecos was sunk south of Christmas Island. Whipple sped to the scene and managed to rescue 232 men. A total of 288 men from Langley were initially classified as missing in action following the loss of Langley and Pecos. Later, in 1945, that number was amended to 319, which includes the Army Air Force personnel who were embarked. Langley was awarded 2 battle stars for her World War II service. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me do what I do, and I greatly appreciate it. If you want to join me in preserving history, be sure to check out our channel membership options down below and the perks associated with them. Once again, thank you for watching.